A graveyard shift was in effect. I brought a cup of black coffee with a high caffeine content to my desk and logged on. For me, dozens of alerts were waiting. I sighed and massaged my chin stubble. When I graduated, this wasn't the life I had imagined, but I had graduated with a degree and a mound of debt. The work also paid me a monthly salary. In the interest of national security, I worked for the agency, a division of the government that functioned outside the purview of open accountability. I was a communications technician, a low-level stooge who got digital dung thrown at him while being kept in the dark. But the first alert was opened. It was a sound file that the organization's monitoring program had recorded. The reach of digital tendrils projects extended well beyond the borders of the nation. An alert would be activated by specific words and phrases, as well as by transmissions from particular places. I would then have to choose whether or not to elevate an alert. In the future, a wise would be able to do this, but for the time being, it was my duty. The length of the audio file was 7 seconds. As I hit play, I yawned, hearing escalating amounts of underground activity. "It's off the scale. Please advise." A man's voice could be heard above the background hiss. It was understandable that he appeared anxious. He seemed to be under a lot of pressure based on the little information I knew. Was it sufficient for me to send this upstairs, though? A transmission time and the location from which it was sent are included with the sound file. The transmission time was verified. It had been there for 6 hours. I wasn't surprised by that. Although we tried to process the alerts as quickly as possible, there was always a backlog that caused delays. I then opened a map of the area and saw that it had originated from an Arctic civilian research facility in the very middle of nowhere. I brought up another view, this time shot from a satellite that had just passed over the location 2 hours earlier by the library image that I had on my computer screen. I immediately enlarged. My body started to feel cold. There was no longer a research base, just ruins remained. The prefab units that had been used to build the base were torn and damaged. I could make out pieces of machinery lying about on the freezing ground. As soon as I realized I was not going to find any human remains, I stopped looking. As I raised the warning, my hand started to tremble. I had to complete a basic medical exam as part of the recruitment procedure to join the agency. I needed to be in good enough shape to type for 12 hours straight without passing out. There it was. I was aware that other agency employees were working in the field and risking their lives while I sat at my desk on my ever-expanding rear. And I had no problem with this division of tasks. I wasn't made for risk. I went to the company canteen to purchase 2 donuts to help me relax after seeing the satellite image. By the time I had finished eating them and was sifting through the never-ending stack of notifications, I had already forgotten about the research base. Now, it was being handled by other individuals who had more experience and were getting paid significantly more than I was. By the time my shift was through, I was mostly worried about whether or not my terrible next-door neighbors would have their TV on full blast when I got home. I couldn't sleep because of this. I made an effort to explain that. Because I worked nights, I required some solitude during the day. They didn't give a damn, though. I signed out, sat up slowly, stretched, and made my way to the door. History was yet another graveyard shift. My supervisor, however, showed up as I was searching for my pass to swipe myself out. Even though we only sat a dozen feet apart, he usually remained in his own office and messaged me. Observing him approaching me while bearing a grimace, my stomach tightened at it. "What's your destination?" he questioned, sounding to me as if I were acting improperly. "Home, huh?" I answered. "Oh no, you're not," he muttered while shaking his head and folding his arms over his chest. "Recently, high management called me. You need to head upstairs to briefing room number 1 right away. You now have access thanks to an updated pass. I don't know why they want you, but if you do something wrong and it reflects poorly on me, I'll make your life miserable." He hissed as he pushed in closer. "Capis." I was limited to nothing but a pitiful nod and a shuffle toward the elevator. Although I had no idea what was happening, I felt like everyone was losing out in this situation. I daydreamed about my neighbor's TV keeping me up while the elevator rose. That suddenly didn't seem all that horrible after all. I was taken to the higher floor of the agency building via the elevator a little while later. There was nowhere I had ever been. The early morning light that was coming in through the windows caused me to blink uncomfortably as I took a glance around. The door on the opposite side of the corridor was also exceedingly gleaming. A man emerged as it opened. He appeared to be around my age, but he was clean-shaven, dressed sharply in a dark suit, pristine white shirt, and perfectly shined shoes. Because I didn't even have an iron, and it was my third consecutive night wearing it, I was keenly aware of how wrinkled my shirt was. Agent Wilcox was his name, and he extended his hand. After a brief shaking, he said, "This way." He then turned around and entered the space once more. I needed to use the restroom the most due to my growing uneasy stomach, but I decided that I should follow him. I inhaled deeply before entering the space. The room was dominated by a big table that was exceedingly glossy. Around it sat a dozen gray-haired men in matching suits. They all had a gloomy appearance. Wilcox was standing next to a wall-mounted screen. The screen was filled with a satellite view of the devastated research base. As Wilcox cleared his throat and then started speaking, I stood there feeling uneasy since I had no idea what I was supposed to do. We were 35 years ago, which has been read to you all. The command team thought it had been permanently resolved at the time, so when the new research base was spotted there 2 years ago, there were no alarms raised. We now understand that this was an incorrect assessment of the situation as a result of the alert we received yesterday night. He took a brief pause to allow this to fully register before moving on. Since there were no more signals from the base yesterday night, we can say that the tragic event happened quickly and entirely. Therefore, we are currently in cleanup mode. For the benefit of the general public, a myth has been made that the damage was brought on by seismic activity. Finding and eliminating the incident's perpetrators will be our next course of action. The agency's resources are primarily targeted at addressing cyber threats, as we all know. In addition, we have personnel stationed in sectors 618 and 31. Simply said, we lack the active individuals to address issues in the Arctic. That is why I think we should revive the group that handled this issue in 1988. This is an odd strategy, but I'm suggesting it since there is an issue and no other option. After saying this, he took a second to pause and scan the room. The suits exchanged quick looks. They nodded and smiled warily before one of them remarked, "Approved." Wilcox answered, "Thank you, sir. We won't let you down," as his arm trembled as if he were trying to hold back a salute. He motioned for me to follow him as he started to walk out of the room. I did, my stomach turning and my thoughts racing. We got back in the elevator, but this time, it brought us up rather than back down to the familiar and safe ground level. I then discovered myself stepping outside onto the agency's building's roof. There was a transporter helicopter parked in the middle of a helipad. I had only ever seen one up close, on television and in movies, and it appeared to be enormous. A serious piece of equipment. "This, isn't it beautiful?" Wilcox asked as he turned to face me. "Let's board the ship and set sail. Here, time is of the importance." Me, on a chopper? No way, I reasoned. Okay, I tried to explain, but I can't. My shift ended, so I needed to go home right away to recover before returning to my desk at 8 p.m. He gave a headshake. "I'm seconding you to fill the position of comm specialist on the team I'm putting back together because you are knowledgeable about the most recent technology. I'll discuss it with your boss. Get your behind into gear right now." "Now, you are a field agent, a local agent." "No." I tried to object, but the sound of the helicopter's blades spinning into motion overpowered my argument. I stumbled onto the helicopter on lengths that felt like they were missing all of their bones. I was so relieved to see that there was a bathroom. Even though it was crowded, I didn't mind. After a bit, I came out and wended my way to a seat, where I buckled up. I could see through the window that we were flying over the city. 5 years prior, I had spent my time here and considered it to be a dull and cluttered location. But from above, the interconnected motorways, and groups of buildings had an energy that changed the way I perceived the location. Even as we started to leave the city behind, I experienced disappointment. We soon passed past the planned patterns of family home estates as the structures became more apart. A sports field was located on the border of one of the estate. I could make out the teams playing in a baseball game, but they quickly disappeared and the landscape spread out in front of us. The vista began to be dominated by dispersed farms surrounded by fields. I smiled as I turned away from the window. Despite everything, I noticed that I was having fun. I questioned whether there was a catering staff on board. The ideal breakfast would have been a triple sausage and egg muffin with a side of coffee. When the helicopter started to descend, I was about to ask Wilcox how I placed my order. I took a look at the approaching earth outside. It was a large area of weed-covered land that bordered a building. We abruptly touched down. Nathaniel Jones was the squad leader who handled the initial incident, Wilcox stated as he turned to face me. He retired from the agency 8 years ago and has been residing here ever since. Of course, we've kept a file on him. The file contains a note that you ought to be aware of. Approach with caution. It instructs. He left that remark unfinished and got out of the aircraft. I sat there gazing into space because I couldn't see why I was required. Up until I couldn't look away from Wilcox's sneering expression, I clambered out of the way reluctantly and followed him as he strode towards the property. It was a dilapidated wood cabin, located in the center of a yard full of abandoned pieces of machinery. No trespassers, no hawkers, and no authorities read a notice that was attached to a stake. "Jones, do you realize we're coming?" I queried. Wilcox responded that he doesn't have a phone or an internet connection, and that the organization hasn't utilized carrier pigeons in a century. No, wonderful, I thought, my belly twisting hard inside of me once more. Wilcox wasn't displaying any signs of fear. He approached the door and gave it a hard knock. A man was standing inside when the door squeaked open and revealed itself. Although I couldn't see his face, I could tell that he wasn't happy to see us as he was aiming both barrels at us. I recoiled. "I'm Ancient Wilcox," he declared in a crazily calm voice. "I'm here to put into effect the contract provision that orders you back to work." Jones must have chewed tobacco since a disgusting glob of the substance ended up on one of Wilcox's immaculately shined shoes. I assumed that meant Jones didn't want to work for an agency once more. Wilcox took a quick look at his sneakers but continued with his business as usual. "There has recently been a fresh occurrence in the Arctic. Which is the cause?" "It was in the very same spot where, in the 1980s, you and a group of other operatives zapped enemies into nothingness." Jones responded by laying down his firearm. He had a long gray beard, and his face looked worn. "Wow," he remarked. "Tell me, are they coming back?" Wilcox replied seriously, "I'm afraid that's the case. I've been given the go-ahead to reactivate the original squad so we can handle the threat." Jones suddenly started laughing at this, which surprised me. "Son, are you really real?" When he was in control of himself, he spoke. "The squad is less than half dead, and the rest of us are simply plain old. Your country needs you," Wilcox continued as he straightened up and cleared his throat. "How much would my country pay me for my time?" Jones questioned after taking a moment to look him in the eye. "Naturally, tax-free and in cash." Wilcox specified a cost. It cemented the deal because it was significantly more than what I made in a year. Jones smiled, showing off a row of discolored and broken teeth. Jones and I were briefly introduced before they boarded the helicopter and got to talking. I continued to mutter under my breath as I went. We were back in the air 10 minutes later. The seat next to mine belonged to Jones. He was snoring loudly and was sound asleep. I was left with the impression that it was too late to request a pay hike as Wilcox was entering something into a tablet computer, and when the chopper started to descend once more, I was still attempting to summon the guts to ask. I turned to look at the area where we were landing on a barren piece of land. It was a close fit, and I dared not look as the helicopter's blades nearly removed some of the guttering's bars. Why we were here was a mystery to me. This was no longer a surprise. I was being kept in the dark and receiving dirt even though I was a field agent. Ones whom I observed followed Wilcox as they left. Despite being older than me, he is considerably nimbler on his feet. We turned around and went to the front, where the word Muldoon's was written in faded lettering on the glass. The fact that there were cigarette ends and pieces of shattered glass all over the floor made it obvious that this was not an upscale restaurant. I acknowledged that I had overstepped my bounds as I followed the other two inside. Abandon all hope. Why who entered here would have been appropriate to post over the door. Even though it was still only a little after noon, the bar was surrounded by a gloomy dust cloud. At the lengthy, filth-covered bar, men were huddled over their glasses in silence. There were flies everywhere, little creatures that had no regard for human privacy. I had to cover my mouth and nose with my hand because the smell of stale sweat and beer was so strong. Even though I was a slob, the other customers and the bar's proprietor had raised the bar on shabby behavior. Even Wilcox's flawless veneer seems to have slightly slipped given how horrible it was. But Joan didn't appear to be upset. He could see some men standing around a pool table in the opposite corner of the bar. As my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I noticed that 6 decent old boys were watching the pool game while simultaneously using one hand to swat away flies. One of the players moved forward to take a shot while wearing a baseball cap backward and with his stomach hanging over his belt. He swung the ball far wide, yelled, picked up a bottle of beer, and took a huge gulp. The second player moved swiftly and fluidly while being tall and rangy. With one shot, he placed 2 balls in opposing pockets. I felt inspired. It came out that his rival was not. Dane, the son of a cheater, he roared and slammed the empty bottle against the pool table's side. "I'll demonstrate to you what happens to hustlers in this area," he yelled, turning around the table and pointing the jagged edge of the bottle at the man he had accused of lying. The muscular man held his position until his furious opponent drew near, at which point he seized the arm carrying the bottle's tip. I groaned. The pub was filled with the sound of a bone cracking, which was quickly followed by a pained yell. Holding his shattered arm in his hands, the man who had been holding the broken bottle knelt on the ground. The spectators who had been watching the pool game up until that point had been standing and observing the altercation, but it was now obvious which side they were on. The man was thrown at by all 6 of them. I briefly considered assisting if we guns only stood there grinning, adding more lines to his face, while Wilcox did not attempt to step in. It turned out that the man was perfectly fine on his own. He launched one of his assailants across the room, into the bar. Another came after, almost touching down at my feet. He appeared to be seeing some real stars based on the glazed look in his eyes. The next 3 would-be attackers were eliminated similarly. The last assailant is upright and has taken a small step back. He decided he needed an advantage and grabbed hold of a few pool cues, swinging them around his head like they were in a bad action film. The man made no eye contact. He launched a boot into the other man's intestines while using the pool table as leverage. The man who had been clutching the pool cues fell to the ground after them. The conflict was over. The victor strolled over and approached Jones directly. After exchanging high fives, Jones announced, "This is Agent Wilcox," to McKinley. I informed him that at this hour of the day, we would find you here, and the radio guy is this young dude. I was unaware that was my official title, but I just went through with it and listened as Jones described how and why the squad was being revived. McKinley declared that he was on board and appeared to take everything in stride. He appeared to be some 10 years older than Jones, placing him well into his 70s, which would have indicated that he was in his late 50s at the time of the initial event. I think that he must have been a tough sob back in the day, given how easily he had just dispatched 7 men. I was happy that we were on the same team and pondered who else might join us, and whether they would share our values. "Who is the next member of the squad that we need to find?" I queried. "You know where we can locate him," Tyler Wilcox responded before turning to McKinley. After chuckling, McKinley moved toward the bar. When the brawl started, the majority of the patrons looked up from their beers and bourbons before getting inebriated and heading back to the day's activities. One of them was completely immobile. I noticed that he was unconscious since his forehead was resting against the bar. The drunk was picked up and brought over to us by McKinley. He introduced Tyler. "That makes the squad complete," Wilcox said with a little smile on his face. "Is that it?" I remarked, but they had already departed. I moaned. I resisted the urge to stay in the bar and continue drinking until I passed out since I hadn't yet given up on life. I prepared myself and made my way to the door. By the time I boarded the chopper, the others had already buckled up in their seats. Tyler must have received aid because he was still severely intoxicated and disoriented. Muldoon's followed the helicopter as it soared, and the elevation increased till the landscape was obscured by the clouds. At the scene of the event, Wilcox gave an update on our arrival time before returning to his tablet. I was exhausted, hungry, and under stress. I was unable to even recall my most recent sleep. Furthermore, I had no chance of sleeping in the chopper. I closed my eyes despite Tyler babbling incoherently, Jones and McKinley snoring in stereo on either side of me, and the helicopter vibrating in the turbulence. I pleaded for a brief period of tranquility. I opened my eyes after hearing someone talk. I felt a hand on my shoulder from Wilcox, who instructed me to get up. What do you know? I had fallen asleep despite not knowing how long I had been away. I stretched, rubbed my eyes, and then I shivered. The interior of the chopper saw a sharp drop in temperature. I took a look out the window. I could just about make out a wide, white plain below through snowflake flurries. We were now flying over a desolate and frozen terrain, and it turned out that I had been sleeping for hours. I felt as though I was on an alien planet because it was so unlike anything I had ever experienced. While I was gazing in wonder, Tyler had returned but still appeared very sleepy as he followed his former coworkers to the back of the cabin while Wilcox moved around the cabin, ordering everyone to get dressed. Although I was aware that I needed to follow them, I was preoccupied with other issues. Wilcox yelled at me when he noticed that I hadn't moved. "Do you have a difficulty?" "Yeah, I guess," I responded. "I'm so hungry that I can't do anything till I eat." Wilcox answered and grinned at me. The backpacks contain fruit concentrates and energy snacks. They're in the storage racks along the road with the cold weather clothing. "Look vivacious, we're about to board." I hurried to the back of the cabin, where I didn't exactly seem lively, and put on the layer of clothing I was hoping would keep me warm out in the freezing waste. I hastened to the door as soon as the chopper touched down. Wilcox gave me a modern satellite phone just before I arrived, and I then exited the aircraft and into the open air. I screamed and stumbled onto the ice. I lay there wondering why no one had told me that the chopper was hovering a few feet above the ground rather than landing, and moaned and pulled myself to my feet while attempting to ignore the grins on the other people's faces. Then, as the helicopter climbed into the air, the power of the downdraft from the propeller blades knocked me over once again, causing me to land on my backside once more. I stood up and mentally composed the agency's resignation email before brushing myself off. The 3 veteran squad members appeared to be moving quickly, even though they were carrying quite heavy weapons. Wilcox followed suit while using a more streamlined weapon. Not that I was awestruck. With every step, I grumbled as I followed them. I started having trouble breathing right away, and after a few minutes, a stitch had spread over my chest. "How far away is it?" In between gasps, I yelled. Wilcox broke the unpleasant news to me. "The distance to the research base is a mile. We'll start the pursuit as soon as we find the scene." I scowled and continued to stumble. I was so exhausted by the time we got to the base that I thought I was going to throw up. My throat burned as I dropped to the ground and sat there, inhaling the icy air. My nose was running, my eyes were watering, and I could feel the clothing underneath my layer of insulation clinging to my perspiration-covered skin. I've never been so miserable in my life, I can honestly say. Wilcox, Jones, McKinley, and Tyler were moving in front of me as they maneuvered through the remains of the research base. Back at my desk, I was astonished when I saw the remains on the satellite image for the first time. But it's hard to remove yourself from the image, just like with any other image seen on a screen. What could be more unsettling in this era of tremendous information overload than another image? But as I sat there and watched the team carefully navigate the debris, the sorrow of what had happened here became all too real. I looked down, embarrassed by my self-pity, got to my feet, and followed the others when they had gone. I was trying to figure out what I could do to be of assistance. They were having a private conversation when I caught up to them. It is exactly like 1988. Tyler and McKinley nodded in agreement with what Jones was saying. "I've read the report that was submitted after you completed the mission," Wilcox said as he turned to face Jones. "If you could go through the sequence of events once more, that would be helpful. It would be better if I had additional information." Jones's eyes furrowed, and I pondered whether he was having trouble remembering what had happened because his memory had become hazy with age. When Jones started speaking, I immediately knew that I could not have been more mistaken. At 800 on September 17th, the call was received. Our clandestine research facility at a military base had been attacked. This had been made plain in a panic communication, followed by radio silence. The Army was preparing to launch a massive assault, even though nobody knew what kind of attack it was. However, it takes time. At the time, the squad consisted of 9 of us. We were experts at entering dangerous situations where upholding concealment was essential. We were therefore activated by the agency and would always arrive first. When we arrived at the scene of the incident and saw that there had been extensive damage, we knew that whatever had caused it had struck quickly and violently. We started to follow tracks in the ice leading north and northwest from the damaged base after making sure there were no survivors. It was a clear trail because no new snow had fallen. The squad's members had all tracked animals, but none of us had ever encountered anything like this. I have no problem telling you right now that I was afraid. When early mapmakers lacked knowledge about a particular location, they scribed here be monsters on the maps, and I sensed that we were moving into uncharted country as we followed the railroads, that creatures would be there to await us. Jones stopped and appeared to be overcome with emotion. To witness such a strong man laboring in this way was unsettling. He inhaled deeply and then continued. "We came across them 5 clicks from the base, as you are aware from the report. Despite losing 2 men, we participated in the battle with the utmost prejudice and won. Decent males with little families. We made our way back to the base after performing one more sweep of the area to make sure there were no living examples of the creatures left. By now, the troops had arrived. We left them to it while they worked to clear the area. At that point, all we wanted was to leave the scene and say goodbye to our friends. We then assumed that was all. The work was finished. We discovered that we were completely mistaken. Here, the dead bear witness to that." Jones' voice started to tremble once more. Despite how tough he was, he did not have a heart of stone. After uninterrupted listening, Wilcox remarked, "I've seen the Army's report as well. They didn't suggest looking beneath the wreckage's foundation level. According to my theory, the eggs that were left to hatch underground and mount the next generation have been found. I'll get this area thoroughly sanitized. Therefore, it won't happen again. But first, we went on a bug search for ourselves. Let's leave now." I had a lot of inquiries. Compared to the others, one was more urgent. "A bug search? Why do you say that?" "Exactly," I queried, but nobody responded since they were already relocating away from the debris. I grumbled, "Just typical," and jogged after them. Snow was starting to fall, and the wind was causing the flakes to swirl. I was concerned that if the weather became worse, it would be simple to lose track of the others if they got too far ahead. As it was, I could see that they were moving along a crooked line of ground markings. But up ahead, the tracks were already starting to get covered in snow. I could still make out their shapes, but I wasn't sure how long that would last. We lost the traces after 15 minutes of the pursuit. "Are you able to obtain satellite photographs on your phone?" Wilcox asked as he turned to face me. "The locations of the bugs must be known," I said. "Oh yeah, I think so. And while you're at it, if you can order some pizza." Jones continued with a smile. Even though I was in the mood for pizza at the time, I chose to ignore him and continue working to see if I could locate satellite images of the area. Even I was surprised by what I did. 50 minutes prior, the satellite had completed a flyby. I halted after scrolling through the picture and simply saw an uninterrupted white space. I had missed something because I was moving too quickly. I turned around and noticed that the ice was dark. The darkness became splintered into bright bits as I zoomed in. The bugs in Must Have Been were to blame. They were south of us, 7 miles distant. When I showed Wilcox and Jones the picture, Jones mumbled a smirk before commenting, "There's more of the critters than last time. A lot more." As a result, the odds are in their favor. Wilcox appeared unfazed. "I'm not here to be eradicated. I'm here to eradicate. Negativity is also not part of the strategy. Do you agree with that?" Jones shrugged, wishing I had agreed to a bonus based on the quantity of bugs eliminated. "Aside from that, I certainly am. The earlier we get moving, the better because we have a long journey ahead of us." Wilcox grinned quietly. "I have a superior scheme. They react violently to movement, according to my theory. So, let's invite them to come to us rather than wasting energy by going to them." He pulled out a flare rifle from his rucksack. He fired flare after flare while aiming it high in the air. The sky was lit up by light explosions. Bullcock appeared content. "We will now wait," he replied softly. The others appeared content to carry out this. They remained there, gripping their rifles, gazing off towards the horizon. No sign of dread could be seen on their features. I have never been and will never be like them. I began to tremble. My entire body shook, as though there were an electric current coursing through it. To regain control, I clamped my mouth firmly, but this only made my teeth clatter louder. I could feel my heart racing frantically, while I was also exhaling heavily through my nostrils, my breaths iking in the air in front of me. But we continued to wait. My imagination was in full swing as I examined the horizon. We had the impression that the end of the world was approaching. Want a catastrophic event to rip the land and sky apart. There was a quiet there from one of the ones by my side. The one word was very clear and foreboding in the complete silence, which was only interrupted by my laborious breathing. My heart beat more quickly. I strained my eyes to the horizon but was still blind. "It is what? What did you observe?" Wilcox raised an arm and pointed calmly at the horizon. Finally, I noticed some movement. It was a shadowy figure that was speeding directly toward us, and it wasn't by itself. 6, 10, and 20 were present. I muttered some expletives. There were progressively more of them visible. The barren landscape had now become a hive of shadowy activity. I forced myself to glance away from the terror that was barreling toward us and to the others. Even better, none of them even raised their firearms. I pleaded with you to blast them before it's too late. Vince gave a headshake. He claimed that they were not close enough. His gaze was riveted forward. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. It wasn't close enough. They gave me a sufficient glance. Each beetle was the size of an adult male. Each one had 6 long, pointed legs. They had heavy slabs for thoraxes. In my mind, fear made these into armor-plated pieces of a monstrous machine. Their awful bodies ended in protruding abdomens. They continued to draw nearer until I could make out their segmented eyes and sharp mandibles, which appeared to sparkle with malice. The others were now raising their firearms. John said, "Hold on." A dark flood of hideous bugs that was poised to engulf us was approaching as the nightmare accelerated. "Fire," said Joan. As the weapons fired, a whirlwind of sound and light broke. I instinctively covered my ears with my hands and briefly shut my eyes. The environment had turned into a blur of insects as I looked up, being torn apart by successive bursts of a seething line of weapon fire. Their caisson broke apart and spiraled away, and it has shot out a heavy liquid. The remnants of dead and dying bugs continued to astound me. My cheek was sliced open by a severed mandible. As the bug's blood sprayed into my open lips, I howled in agony. I stumbled forward as nausea poured through me and nearly ran over a bug that was still intact before it was cut in half. I opened my eyes in the haze to see Jones beaming as he unleashed round after round of carnage on the advancing swarm. The insects were everywhere around us. In their haste to reach us, they were rushing over the corpses of their killed relatives. Some of them flew above our heads on their momentum, others charged directly at us, each being met with fatal force. I was reduced to standing there in utter terror. I was in Hades, and the suffering seemed never-ending. A bug smashed inches from my face, and the burst of body pieces nearly blinded me. I sank to my knees, gagging and scrabbling at my face. I let out one last burnt trail of bile before looking up. Although there were numerous bug corpses, no more live insects were rushing toward us. The other people had turned and were firmly gripping their weapons. The triggers were still depressed, but none of them were shooting. The bugs that had survived were running away as they watched. The bugs were fleeing, and I suddenly felt optimistic that we had prevailed. I triumphantly punched the air. The others, on the other hand, were puzzled as to why I struggled to stand up, and noticed that the bugs were starting to loop back on themselves. When I realized they weren't running, I gasped in fear. They had us in their sights. We were encircled by bugs in less than a minute. "They are doing what?" I queried. Wilcox gave the response, learning. "They will attempt to attack us from all directions now that they realize a head-on assault won't succeed." I was overcome with fear at the thought and turned to face the group of bugs. They were excited, but they were keeping their distance. One started to clack its teeth together. The other people soon joined in, raising the horrible, piercing rhythm. I thought I was going to lose my mind as the cacophony got louder and louder. "Why don't they just go for the kill?" I screamed. "Why don't they simply finish it up?" I could see from the way the others were glancing at one another that no one had a response for me. We could do nothing but wait. But did we? My memory of the satellite phone instantly returned. All I had to do was make a call for assistance, even though I had dropped it during the attack. The helicopter transporter could save us. I started anxiously scouring my surroundings for the phone. At first, I couldn't see anything but had a terrible feeling it was hidden beneath the horrifying bug carcasses. Once again on my knees, I dug through the chunks of slime and discovered it hidden beneath a bug's organs, ignoring these slithery parts. I grabbed the phone, partially cleaned its screen with my sleeve, and started tapping away at the keys. However, nothing I did caused the gadget to turn on. When I felt a hand on my shoulder, I had already cursed at it, shaken it, and was about to start banging it against the ground to see if it would make the cursed thing work. Jones was there. He said in a soft voice, "Leave it, son." I put down the satellite phone and started to cry. I felt embarrassed by my actions, but I was powerless to stop myself. After a while, the tears stopped, and I looked up while wailingly wiping my face. The others were boldly gazing out at the ring of moving bugs after forming their little defense circle. While their initial assault had been swift, this time they were moving more slowly. It appeared as though a shadow was spreading across the ground as they approached us. The horrifying darkness advanced gradually. Now that their mouths were silent, the only sound I could make out was my labored breathing. 12 and then 10 feet separated the bugs. I could see that the others were preparing to fire since they had their rifles lifted and shoulder-mounted. But with the bugs coming at us from all sides, I couldn't see how they could prevent the infestation from overwhelming us. I shut my eyes. I was unable to look, so all I could do was pray that it would end quickly. I then heard a sound. Although it seemed far away, I could identify the noise. I felt a spark of hope. I raised my eyes to the sky. I could hear the sound of blades beating louder, and I could make out a vessel off in the distance. It wasn't by itself. 3 helicopters were approaching us quickly. The horsemen were present. They swooped low when they got close to us and started raking the ground around the edge of the circle of bugs. The bugs started to disperse in a helpless panic. When Jones noticed this, he yelled with joy. Tyler and McKinley joined in, giving each other high fives. Wilcox cheered while wearing a broad smile. Compared to the transporter that had carried us here, the helicopters that had rushed to our aid were slimmer, meaner machines. They also carried the Army's markings, the Army of our nation. We were far from home, so this was like running into an old friend. The bugs kept on dispersing in waves as we cheered and whooped. Once we were out of harm's way, I braced myself for the helicopters to start dropping destruction and complete the task we had started. Not at this moment, Mercy. It was necessary to eradicate these insects from the planet. But when their weapons stopped firing and the helicopter started shooting nets, I was startled. These were sizable sheets of densely woven mesh that were heavily weighted at the edges. They covered and caught the bugs as they landed, despite their frantic attempts to escape. However, the more they fought, the more tangled they got. The helicopters landed after capturing all of the bugs. Soldiers poured out of each and rushed in our direction. As they did, they began to yell at us to kneel and pointed their rifles at us. Suddenly, I didn't feel like I was being saved. Instead, I felt like I was once more under attack. I cried out for mercy as a cold metal barrel was pressed against the back of my head and a soldier was screaming in my ear as I collapsed to the ground. Although I had not resisted, I could hear the other people arguing. They were pleading with the soldiers to stop threatening them and to explain what was happening. Everything seemed to be in vain. I timidly raised an eyebrow and noticed a pair of bright army boots walking away. The man's uniform was equally well cut throughout. The soldiers cleared the way for him, and he spoke with the assurance of an officer. This situation is now being taken over by the army. You'll be driven back to a military base to go through processing. You lack the necessary power. Wilcox forced entry. You're outnumbered by my men, son, the officer scoffed, and this is already over. We'll depart quietly if you kill the bugs and clean up their nest, Wilcox answered. This made the officer chuckle out. Your agency lads are dumb hicks, he said. Even though this garbage occurred 35 years ago, you losers slaughtered every living species. Please remove these pets from my sight. I was hauled to my feet, marched to one of the helicopters, and manhandled inside after this final, despicable insult was shouted out as an order. After me, the others were packed in. We were ordered to gather in a circle on the helicopter's floor as it was powered up while being guarded by armed guards. We then began to ascend into the air while no longer being free men. We were treated as state prisoners. They're idiots, Jones muttered. The consequences of even one of the bugs escaping near a populated area are unthinkable. Wilcox retorted, idiots who hold all the cards. I wish I could say their actions surprise me, but they don't. The agency and the army have previously clashed. Even though we all salute the same flag, we may not always be on the same side. What will we do as a result? Jones prompted. Wilcox sadly shook his head. I'll get in touch with my agency supervisors as soon as I can, but I don't believe it will make a difference. With the captured bugs in tow, the army will vanish while denying their presence. I was worn out and my nerves were shot. The last straw was hearing Wilcox's voice and hearing his desperation. Despite the cold and the vibrations that shook me to my very core, I curled up on the helicopter's floor and dozed off periodically. I woke up, but we weren't moving anymore. It took me a long time to drag myself to my feet because every part of me hurt. The guards kept an eagle eye on me, possibly wondering if I was planning to pull a fast one. And that was impossible because I was a damaged guy. I was given to a fresh group of grim-faced soldiers as I exited the helicopter. My wrists were fastened with cuffs, and I was forced in the direction of a waiting jeep. Tyler, Jones, and McKinley were being escorted into a different jeep. They had to shuffle because their ankles were also constrained. But unlike me, they carried themselves with pride. Wilcox was already in a third jeep, and as far as I could tell, was not restrained in any way. I assumed that because of his status, he was receiving what would pass for VIP treatment. After all, he was a legitimate senior agent. I was hauled back to a dark area to have more manure shoveled on my head, while the other 3 members of the old squad were yesterday's news. I used to believe that the reason I was in such a bad condition was because my noisy neighbors kept me awake. Moreover, there was a job that had no future but was of no consequence. I was imprisoned in a space that was 10 paces long and 4 paces wide, with no windows. A hole in the ground and a steel bed with a small mattress and thin blanket were present. A tray was slid through a hatch in the bottom of the door that opened twice daily. In prison, every day was a dried-out meatloaf day. I had been imprisoned in that room for roughly 2 weeks when the door clicked open and was opened by a man in a dark suit. However, I lost track of time insanely quickly. I didn't ask him who he was or where he was taking me as he led me down a featureless corridor at this point, because I was so confused. We were given access to another door, and we left into the night. I wish I could say that after this, everything turned out okay. I received financial compensation and apology from the army and the agency for how I was treated. I learned that the bugs had been eliminated and that Wilcox and the former squad were free. However, none of that occurred. I was placed in a car and driven through the night till we arrived in an unfamiliar city. I received a new fake ID card, 200 in an envelope, and my social security number, and instructed to leave. That occurred nearly 2 years ago. I wash dishes at a diner and spend any extra money on cheap alcohol that makes me feel numb for at least a few hours, but burns as it goes down. There is just one thing I can say with certainty right now as I lay there in the dark in my cramped world. On 2 legs, the actual monsters of this planet can be found.